Hi, this is Tim Weber from South Texas College, coming to you with the video, part one, introducing you to the topic of lifespan human development. And so let's bring up a outline on your screen here to help you follow along. There we are. And let's get rid of my face. So I have to look at that the whole time. And I need a pointer just so I can kind of help highlight where I'm concentrating. Okay, so first chapter of your textbook, which is called Introduction. So we're going to look at some of the basic themes and basic concepts that you'll be encountering throughout the course here. And let's start then by looking at the objectives of this chapter, which will be in the two videos I put together for this chapter. We'll be looking at 5 characteristics of development. We'll also be looking at 3 domains in which development takes place. We'll look at 3 overlapping contexts that affect development. We'll look at a relationship between concepts of race, ethnicity, and culture. Should be culture in there also. We'll have a look at the basic steps of the scientific method, general research methods that are used to study people, as well as special methods used to study human development. And we'll have a look at this ecological systems approach and ethical issues in research with humans. There's a whole bunch of stuff in this chapter. Some of it you may say, I have no idea, don't understand what in the world domains of development are. Don't worry, once you've gone through this, you're going to know what those are all about. Okay, so first of all, the study of human development, lifespan human development, is defined as the scientific study of how and why people change or remain the same over time. So we'll be looking at this whole thing through the lens of the lifespan perspective and how this evolves over the course of a person's lifetime, from the time of their conception all the way through the time of the person's death. We'll be looking for continuity. In other words, what things tend to stay consistent that don't seem to change much, as well as looking for discontinuity as time goes on. In other words, the changes that occur. And we'll also try to track down also some of the why of that as well. So the study of human development today then takes the empirical approach. In other words, we rely on collecting data, making observations, or even conducting experiments to understand how development occurs. So we try to avoid simply approaching this from guesswork and speculation, rather collecting information, basically using the scientific method. Now, as we study human development, we also have to recognize that there is great diversity amongst humans. Obviously, there is great diversity in the age of humans, but also there is diversity in terms of gender and great cultural diversity from one group of people to another, different ethnicities as well, as we'll look at. And so we have to recognize that all of this diversity also can influence how people develop as well. We'll get into some of the details as we look closer at some of that stuff. So in looking at human development as a science, the same scientific method is used here as we might use to study chemistry, physics, biology, any other science. It's still basically the same process. So the researcher, first of all, in conducting research is going to have a research question. There is something about human development that they want to investigate. And they begin by then developing a hypothesis, which is a testable prediction. So they predict that as they study this, that they're going to find some particular thing, and they state that in such a way that it could be tested. They then test that hypothesis by making observations using one of a variety of research methods in order to collect information or data that is related to that hypothesis. And then having collected that information, having made observations, they can then draw conclusions. Did what they predict turn out to be accurate or did it not? Was their hypothesis, their prediction that they made supported or not? As we do this, then we learn more about how people develop. A fifth part of the scientific method that's often forgotten is the researcher is also responsible to make the findings of that research available to others for a couple of reasons. First of all, so that it can be evaluated by others, so that others can have a look at it and see if they find that research convincing or that they can look at the data that's been collected. In fact, that may enable other researchers to replicate that research. In other words, to conduct similar research if the results of their replication are similar, consistent with what the original research, that increases our confidence in that original research. If we find that it is not consistent with the original research, then we know we have to look at that whole thing a little bit closer and do further research to see how things are. Should mention that much replication that is done in human development is cross-cultural research today, cross-cultural replication. So maybe a researcher has studied some aspect of language development in American children. Another researcher might come along and do the same, replicate that research, but with a different group of children, maybe investigating Japanese children with the same concept to see if that's similar or if there is cultural differences. Cross-cultural replication is a very important type of it for human development. Okay, about making findings available. The other reason that it's important that the researcher make findings available is that those can potentially be useful in increasing the welfare of others. Now, in some cases, well, typically, the way that the researcher makes those findings available, they write it up and they send it to a scientific journal that then it's reviewed, and if it's deemed to be worthwhile, is published. Reviewed then by other peers in the science of human development. In some cases, though, the researcher may be ethically bound to immediately release the results of that research. If they find that there is something that significantly would immediately impact public health, for example, they may be actually justified in releasing that information directly to the media or to agencies that can follow up using that information before they wait to have it published in a journal somewhere. Okay, now, how this scientific method might actually play out in real life happens to show up in the example of SIDS research. SIDS is sudden instant death syndrome. This is something that happens sometimes with babies while sleeping. They just stop breathing and they can pass away as a result. And even today, we're not fully understanding of just how and why this happens, but nonetheless, some years ago, they noted, Australian researchers noted that this was much more common in their Australian population amongst people that had European ancestry. On the other hand, less common amongst Asian Australians. And so they initially thought that, well, maybe there was just some genetic difference amongst those two populations, and maybe that's why the difference in odds of SIDS occurring was less common in the Asian population. So that was kind of the accepted answer for quite some time. until another researcher came along and they had a new idea. And they had noted that, well, there was one big difference in how Asian and European ancestry Australians cared for their babies. And that was that the Asian parents laid the babies on their backs to put them to sleep, whereas the European ancestry folks, Anglo folks, would put them other ways rather than on the backs. And so they formulated then the hypothesis that the cause of this difference ethnically was actually the practice of how they laid the babies down. And so they went and they did some research to then ascertain amongst babies that were laid on their back to sleep as opposed to other positions, no matter what the cultural background, what was the chance of SIDS occurring. And they found out whether it was in European or Asian populations, if the baby was laid on their back to sleep, they were less likely to experience SIDS, die from that. So they found out that it was not indeed genetic, but it was rather a practice. Now, the researchers, having found this to be very, very significant, immediately released that information rather than waiting for it to be published. And some Danish researchers encountered that information. And so they also studied this by actually having parents either lay their babies on their backs or other positions, and found out that once again, this replication indicated that this was accurate. It was the positioning. And so having then demonstrated that in that replication, they then began a national back to sleep, as they called it, campaign, informing parents that it was safest to put their babies on their backs when they put them down to sleep. And lo and behold, they also tracked the incidence of SIDS in their population, and it decreased as more and more parents followed that, and indeed was less likely to happen. So notice how the steps of the scientific method led to a breakthrough that saved a lot of lives. Okay, so let's then move on to one of the most important distinctions that we look at here in lifespan development, and that is the potential contribution of nature or nurture to various developments. So nature, we might say, is primarily a matter of genes and what those genes code for in terms of how our body's constructed, and the processes that it does, and the natural course of development. So those genes then provide us with certain inborn traits like our height, eye color and all that kind of stuff, right? As well as potentially even temperament and personality related traits to some extent. These provide the capacities that we have, as well as potentially limits to our abilities. On the other hand, nurture has to do with then the influence of our environment on development, the influence of our experience. So sometimes this might be indicated by contrasting heredity, our genetic heritage, with the effects of our environment. Or this might also be phrased as the distinction between maturation and learning. So maturation is just what the natural process that the body goes through, whereas learning is something that is dependent upon our environment and the opportunities for learning in our environment, the situations we encounter, and so forth. So one of the things that you should really take to heart when it comes to this is research over and over again has shown that there's very few things that are only influenced by nature, and very few things that are only influenced by nurture. Almost always, both of these play a part in people's development. So it's not a question, is this development a matter of nature or a matter of nurture? But most of the time it's, well, to what extent is each of these involved? And even more of this, you might say, how does one act on the other? How does the person's genetic environment influence the various capacities that they develop, or whether they reach their limits or their potential? Or to what extent does that person's genetic makeup actually influence what environment they're going to choose to be a part of, or what experiences they might have as they go along? They both work together like hands washing one another. That's really how we ought to look at it. So one of the things also that you're going to encounter repeatedly are developments that have either a critical or sensitive period. So critical period. This is a period of time in which a development must occur. If it does not occur within that window of time, then the development does not occur at all. Okay, such as there are certain periods of time prenatally, in other words, before the person is born, where arms or legs must begin to develop. If they do not begin developing during that time window, then they do not develop at all. Okay, so critical period, extremely important for development. Now, other things, there is not necessarily a critical period, but we would say a sensitive period. So this is a period of time when development can occur, okay, where it occurs most readily. So it might occur outside of that sensitive period, but if it's outside of that period of time, it's going to be maybe partial development. It's maybe going to be more difficult to produce that adaptation. Um, Sensitive period development most rarely occurs then. So a good example of that would be language development. So at what point in time does people's language development occur most readily? If you guess the first couple years of life, yeah. In fact, people don't even really have to be taught language to any extent in those first couple years. If they're exposed to it, they just kind of seem to pick it up. Now, you look at later on, if a child hasn't been exposed to language, then they may still learn to use language, but it's going to take much longer for them to get a handle on it. And after a certain point, it may become more and more limited. Now, interestingly, there's been some study of feral children. Feral is Feral. These are children who have been raised apart from human contact. Yes, there actually are some children that have had no human contact. Maybe, for example, one well-known one was raised by actually a pack of wolves. Um, when these children are brought into contact with humans, of course, they don't have any understanding of human language, cannot produce it or understand it. The older the child is when they first have contact with other humans and language, then the less language development. In fact, if they are experiencing puberty or later, then there's almost no language development, maybe getting a few words, and that's about it. So sensitive period makes a difference. Um, okay, so you're going to see that in a bunch of stuff. Okay, now let's now shift to looking at 5 characteristics of development that you will again encounter over and over again. So development is multidirectional, multicontextual, multicultural, multidisciplinary, and also there is the characteristic of plasticity. If you don't have that all written down, don't worry, we're going to do one at a time. So let's have a look at each of these. First of all, development is multi-directional. So throughout the lifespan, there are a variety of gains and losses that occur in many different characteristics and capabilities. And some of these you will see there is continuity. Some things kind of stay consistent, other things not. So here are some patterns of change that you may encounter. The first is this pattern of growth and decline. So some particular characteristic increases to a certain point and then it begins to decrease. So think of things like what? A person's strength uh, just naturally increases up to a certain point in the lifespan till you get into maybe your 20s, maybe 30s. But after that, it begins to decline if we let nature just take its course. Of course, I'm trying to resist that, being over 60 years old and still do some training to maintain what strength I can. But even then, I've got to expect that at some point I'm going to have some losses there. Think of other things, growth and decline, like memory ability. That again continues to improve until you get again into your late 20s and so on, and then begins to decrease somewhat, although probably not as much as a lot of people think. Or here's another example, and this would be height. So people reach their full height in usually their late teens, early 20s, and they're the tallest they'll ever be then, and forever after that, they're going to be shrinking a little bit. We also have then a linear pattern of change as well. So that's this blue line that is just continually increasing, or linear growth also could be, a linear change could also be a constant decrease. So those kind of things, when I ask that in class, what things follow that pattern, people have a little more trouble coming up with stuff. Maybe the most obvious one, but probably least likely to think of, is well, what about age? Yeah, that just continues to accumulate, right? The birthdays just keep adding. Another example of linear growth, though interestingly, is vocabulary. And people's vocabulary continues to accumulate even into old age. Another example would be crystallized intelligence. Crystallized intelligence is the person's knowledge base from which they work, which also continues to increase lifelong. Then we have this pattern of growth in stages, and you can see the stepwise changes here. So the person is at some particular level for a period of time, and suddenly there's a major change, and now they're at some new stage, which might continue for some time and then be followed by another stage. What kinds of things would fit that? Well, how about this? How about kind of the stages of physical development? We can say, well, there's a prenatal stage, right? From the time person is conceived and growing in the womb until they're born. And then once they're born, well, we might say they're sort of in the childhood stage. And then suddenly they reach puberty. And now there is another major change. And once puberty has been completed, now we can say they're in the adult stage, and we might even say, well, there's sort of a stage of senescence where aging starts to ramp up towards the end of life as well. So we can look at those kind of things, growth in stages. Now, you're also going to be running across a number of psychological stage theories here in the course. You'll run into Piaget's cognitive stages. So how people change in their ability to process information, which he saw as having some very sudden and distinct changes at various points. Or you'll run into Freud's psychoanalytic theory, in which he proposes that children progress through a series of what he called psychosexual stages in early childhood. Or you'll run across Erickson's theory of development, where a person throughout their life will progress through a series of psychosocial stages. So we'll give you more information on those after a while. Okay, what else? Oh, we have the pattern of unpredictability. So what is there about people that there are unpredictable gains and losses throughout life? Well, maybe to some extent income, or maybe what, body weight, maybe? Although maybe you could say, well, you could predict that from what a person's doing. But yet in the long term, we might not be able to predict that if we're starting out looking at the person at age 5, what those changes might be when they hit age 30 and so forth. So there are some things that, yes, we cannot predict at this point. Okay. And then we have, lastly, the situation of continuity. So that's where there's no real notable change over long periods of time. You say, well, what is it about people that doesn't change? Well, how about this? How about their fingerprints? Yeah, we carry the same fingerprints lifelong, right? What about biological sex? Yeah, that's one. You still have either XX or XY genes, with a few exceptions. Lifelong doesn't change, even if you change your sexual orientation or something like that, or your appearance, right? Your biological sex still remains that which were received at conception. Eye color, once again, even though eyes may fade and change to some extent, you still have that same basic eye color. So it's a few things like that. Oh, I should mention, here's one. You'll be surprised about this one. Did you know that personality tends to be more consistent than changeable? So continuity, or personality, tends to exhibit more continuity than it does change, even over a lifetime. We'll talk about that later. I know a lot of you are surprised and you're skeptical about that. Okay. Oh, by the way, we should also mention that we should latch on to the concept of dynamic change. In other words, when a change occurs in one area of a person's life, that can set off a whole series of changes in other areas. Think about when a person goes through puberty, and it's primarily a physical change that occurs, but as it does, it sets off so many other changes as people look at them and see them more as adults, and as their interactions with others change, as their interests change, and so on. And just, wow, all kinds of changes occur just based on that physical maturation that's occurring in puberty. So keep that in mind. All right. Now, we should also notice that change is multi-contextual. So there are a number of different contexts that influence a person's development, such as the person's historical context, their historical surroundings. And so, for example, think about how your great-grandparents, if they're still living, or maybe your grandparents if they're really old, think about computers. Do they think about computers the same way you do? You know, say, well, no, they don't. A lot of those people from that historical cohort, that group of people that was born in those days, they think about computers as being, just so complicated, and oh, if you mess around with it, you're going to mess it up, and oh, we don't want to use one of those unless maybe we absolutely have to. On the other hand, your generation, if you will, sometimes we call those cohorts generations. You probably will say, gosh, I don't see how anybody can get along without that computer. And afraid of it? No, I use it all the time. In fact, you might even use it to stay in touch with other people and for entertainment and all kinds of things. So your experience of that is very different based on being a part of a different cohort, different, you might say, generational group. Now, historical context also relates closely to demographics, and that is population patterns that may change over time. So let me show you this slide here about demographics. So historically, populations were pyramid shaped, with the largest group being children. And so more children than adults, and also more adults than elderly people. So that's the way things have been for most of history. But because of a number of modern developments, we are in many parts of the world moving towards a demographic that is an inverted pyramid, or may eventually reach that stage where there are very few children, there are more adults than children, and the largest group becomes the elderly. Now, does that have any implications for development? Would development be different if you experience this historical population pattern as opposed to this emerging pattern? And there's no doubt there's going to be a difference. And so if you grew up in that historical population demographic, you probably then had a lot of brothers, sisters, cousins, and so forth. Adults in this group all also were more numerous than the elderly. So when the elderly family member needed some help, usually there were numerous adults available to assist. Now, as we move towards this emerging pattern, notice that would change. Many children might have no brothers or sisters, maybe few uncles, aunts, cousins. Adults having fewer children also um, might be hard pressed to take care of the larger number of elderly people that are in their family, as fewer adult children are available. So you can see how that would make a difference. So we're going to stop with, that concept, just, pointing that out. We'll look at that again later in some other context, but no, that's going to make a difference. Okay, then we have the context of the person's social economic status. Now, when we bring this one up, a lot of people think of it as income. And income is indeed one part of socioeconomic status. How much money do you make? How much money do you have coming in? And we might go one step further and say, well, a second factor, sort of similar to income but different, is wealth. So wealth would be, well, how much do you actually have access to? So, for example, you might have a ranch family that has a lot of wealth. They might own a lot of land, maybe even have a lot of cattle on that land. But if they can't cash it in to produce income, it's different than if they can. So wealth and income are a bit different. Um, Thirdly, we have the um, the factor of education as part of socioeconomic status. So, what level of education has the person achieved? Do they have a college degree, a professional degree like a doctor, a legal degree? Um, do they have only a high school education? Have they not completed high school? And so forth. And what was the quality of that education? Just how good of an education did they get while they were there? So that's another factor. It's part of this. And then I like to use ones that end with ION, education, location. So where you live is also a part of that. So do you live in a wealthy neighborhood? Do you live in a low income neighborhood? Is your neighborhood one where their crime rates are low? Or are crime rates rampant in your neighborhood? So location. And then vocation, that would be our fifth one, vocation. So what kind of work do you do? Okay, so when they look at this, certain vocations, people kind of rate them higher. like things like being a doctor or a lawyer, um, a professor or something like that, they kind of get rated higher than things like maybe a custodian or a person who does manual labor and so forth. Now, I don't think that's fair because, some of those occupations, we might also call that occupation, right? That we maybe that are maybe not rated as being as high are actually extremely important. Yes, doctors save lives, but you know what? So do plumbers. Plumbers make sure that we have sanitary kind of plumbing, right? If we didn't have that, imagine the illness that would be spread. But yet people don't rank them as highly when it comes to status. So, socioeconomic status has a lot to do about with, how do people rank you, even if it's not fair. Okay. Now, notice that there can be an interrelationship between these factors. And in fact, um, this comes into play often when we have a situation where there is poverty. So, poverty, a lack of income, is often accompanied by lower status in other areas. If you are poor, there is a high likelihood that you're going to live in a neighborhood that's less desirable, where there's more crime, where the housing is not as nice, you name it. There's maybe less opportunities. And if you're poor, there's also a greater likelihood that you are not going to receive as good of an education, or that you may have more difficulty accessing educational opportunities, which may in turn limit your occupational opportunities and the kinds of work that you can get into. So notice that these things, there can be an interrelationship between these. Now, by the way, speaking of poverty and um, all of these things, when we look at this, well, if you are coming from a background of poverty, and I know many of us do, what's your best chance for getting out of poverty for yourself and the next generations? Well, it turns out they found that education over and over again seems to be the key. If you can get the education you need to move up, to improve your income, your location, and your occupational opportunities, education seems to be the best bet for getting out of that poverty kind of situation. Okay, so next we go to development is multicultural. Now we're going to actually cover a couple of other things here, ethnicity and race as well, since people often think of these things kind of together. So starting with culture. Culture is primarily made up of ideas and concepts. It's a pattern for living that's passed down from one generation to another that might involve things like values, what is thought of as being most important, the type of clothing that's worn, the type of homes that people have, the type of foods that's eaten, the ideas that are prevalent, and so on. So culture is primarily on the level of ideas and the way people do things. And by the way, culture does evolve. It doesn't stay the same necessarily generation after generation. It can change over time. Okay, so culture, so we think of, Hispanic culture, or we think of, European cultures and maybe Middle Eastern cultures and so on, you name it. The second one here is ethnic group. So an ethnic group, now notice this is a group of people. Okay, so it's not ideas and the way you do things particularly. A group of people that have a similarity. Maybe they share common national origin. Maybe they have come from Mexico, Cuba, El Salvador, or whatever it might be. Or it might be thing that they have in common is a particular religious background. So in some parts of the world, whether you're Muslim or Hindu, puts you in one ethnic group or another. Or it might be a common language. So those who speak similar language make up that ethnic group. Okay. So next we come to race. So first thing that we have to be aware of is that race is really this kind of a made up distinction. It's what they call a social construction that people have somehow agreed upon that these physical differences, physical appearance means that people are different on every level. So notice that um, it's not based on really looking at people to see are they really different in every way. And in fact, it would say, well, what about genetics? Um, you know, aren't black people different genetically than white people? Well, guess what? They found out that blacks from one part of the world could be very different genetically from blacks in another part of the world. In fact, you might take a black person and a white person and find those two people are more similar genetic than that black person and a black person of a different background. So all of that is sort of a made up thing. And they found that, other characteristics like intelligence and personality and all those kind of things are not something that is consistent with a person's skin color. Has a lot more to do with their environment and what they've learned. So really kind of a made up thing. Now, um, how does each of these influence development? Okay, well, first of all, which of these would you say really has the greatest influence on how people develop? If you said culture, that's what the most of the experts have determined. They would say, in studying this, this seems to be the most influential in people's development. Okay, now, having said that, some people might say, well, what about race? Isn't that actually more influential? And it generally is not. Culture tends to be more influential. There is an exception here, though. And it's not based on the person themselves, but rather on how others interact with them. In a case where a person is discriminated against because of their appearance, if they face injustice simply based on how they look, then yes, we can say on that basis, but it's not really because of race, it's because of people misjudging them. And so we could say, yes, there that can be very influential and for some people critical if they experience discrimination and prejudice based on simply their appearance. Okay. Oh, by the way, just wanted to also comment about a lot of times we talk about Hispanic or Latino culture since we're Rio Grande Valley, think about that. So, mm, uh, usually we think of that in terms of ethnicity and culture, but is Hispanic culture consistently the same everywhere? And the fact is, no, we might consider people from Cuba Hispanic, or relatives from Cuba ancestry, and Mexico also, but notice their culture can be different and not everything is the same. So that's Hispanic or Latino is kind of a blanket term that there can be a lot of variation. In fact, even racially, Hispanics can be anything from Black to European in their ancestry. And so even there, it's not fully consistent. And so you say, well, what is it that makes person, a group, or what makes them Hispanic or Latino? And I guess you'd have to say, well, probably, I guess we have to say maybe common language and having that same language speaking Spanish. But that said, I just got something you might want to think about, especially those of you who are from uh, Hispanic, Latino families. Well, what happens then when we have kids grow up that don't speak Spanish anymore? Then what? Do we still have Hispanic culture? Do we still have Hispanics as an ethnicity? So I think language is a very important one there. Uh, okay, so just something to think about. Okay, all right. Now let's just illustrate how culture might have a significant impact on a person's development. Here's a two-bedroom apartment. And so let's say that we're going to have a family move in here, and here is the family. You have mom and dad, you have an uncle, you have grandma, you have a teenage boy, and you have a newborn, well, let's just say a baby, not necessarily newborn, but still a baby. Okay. So now, who's going to sleep where? Now, one of the first thoughts that's probably going through your mind is, wait a minute, that's too many people for a two-bedroom apartment. I want to tell you that that thought happens to be cultural. Yeah, here in our part of the world, we would generally not be used to that, but there's some parts of the world where they look at that and say, wow, only that many people in there? That's nothing, you know? So that's sort of a cultural thing. How many people live in that household? But let's say, okay, who's going to sleep where? All right, got mom and dad, little baby, adolescent, teenage boy, got grandma and an uncle. So, what about where's the baby going to sleep? Okay. Now, a lot of you being from Mexican American background would probably say, well, of course the baby is going to be there in the bedroom with mom and dad because that's the way we typically do things in that cultural group. Okay. But you may have thought, well, that's just the way it is. But in fact, that is somewhat cultural. If we ask people of Anglo-cultural group, where would the baby sleep? Many of them will place the baby in another room during the night. It's kind of a cultural thing. Now, you may be tempted to take sides and say, well, what's better or what's worse? We'll come back to that. Oh, let me give you one other solution that we sometimes hear for this whole thing. People from some cultural groups will simply say, oh, well, that's easy. All the males sleep in one bedroom, all the females in the other, because that's what they do in their culture. Okay, so once again, the answer differs depending upon culture. Now, getting back to babies sleeping in the room with parents or separately, notice that each practice reinforces certain characteristics or certain strengths. If the baby sleeps there with the parents, notice that fosters a strong bond between the child and parents. That also, it fosters a sense of security and safety on the baby's part. Now, on the other hand, if we have the baby in a separate room, what does that tend to encourage? Well, things like independence and sort of being more individualistic rather than relational. So, a lot of our characteristics that we may not have thought of come partly from our cultural heritage as well as our genetic heritage. Okay, so Let's then consider the difference versus deficiency error. Okay. A lot of times when we look at people who do things differently or who are different, we see them as being deficient. For example, in the old days, what did they think about deaf children? Were they just deaf? No, those children were also assumed to be also intellectually deficient, what we used to call mental retardation. Intellectual disability is what we call it today. They assumed that deaf children were that way, but they found out when the sign language was developed and those children could then use language to communicate, that majority of them were not intellectually disabled at all, and often were just as smart as other kids, and some of them maybe more so. So yeah, you look at that and say, wow, we made the mistake of seeing these kids as being deficient when in fact they weren't. Now that also applies to cultural differences. And so when we look at a cultural difference, we might say, what those people do, it's deficient, because it's not the way we do it. You might see the downsides of it more readily. But we have to also recognize that, again, that may not be a deficiency at all. It may be simply different. Okay, so we have to keep that in mind before we start passing judgment. Okay. All right. Now, just to sum up this whole discussion of context, then the person surrounded by these contexts can be influenced significantly by them. And it may be kind of like be a fish in water. Being in water pretty much influences everything the fish does, although the fish probably never thinks about the water that it's swimming around in. You may not think much of our context and how it influences us, but indeed it often is. Now, the next multi is multidisciplinary. So we need to access information from many different disciplines, many different fields of study to study development. And this leads us to three domains that we'll be kind of referring to throughout the course. So the biosocial domain, this has to do with what our biology, our body, and how it influences our interactions with other people, the social part. So to study this, we have to study the brain, the body, nutrition, genetics, development of motor skills. So we need biologists, nutritionists, geneticists, kinesthesiologists who study development of motor skills, all kinds of different fields to understand that. We also then have the cognitive domain, and that is how we process information. So how we think, how we develop the ability to perceive and interpret information, the use of language to communicate, store information, memory, the development of ethical and moral reasoning, and therefore the influence of education. So we need all kinds of people who study this, psychologists, um, linguists who study language, memory researchers, mostly psychologists, notice also ethicists and educators. And then we have the psychosocial domain, and this are psychological factors that develop and how these again impact how we interact with others and they interact with us. So the study of the emotions, temperament, which is kind of very high strung or easygoing, personality, the development of social skills and interpersonal relationships with family, friends, community, culture, society. So we have all kinds of people that study these kind of things. Again, psychologists, sociologists, we have all sorts of disciplines that we need to consult to understand as well. So here's an example of how that might come into play, just understanding depression. And so from neuroscientists, we have learned that the action of various neurotransmitters can be involved in depression, as well as certain genes that may make people more vulnerable to depression. Psychopathologists have uh, noted that if the person had a caregiver early on in life that was depressed, they also may become depressed as a result. Biologists have noted that lack of exposure to daylight can increase the likelihood of depression, particularly amongst some people. Nutritionists have noted that malnutrition may be responsible for some people's depression. The mm, type of fatty acid ratio in their diet can play a part in it for some people. There's just all kinds of things there. Anthropologists, in studying various cultures, found that if people were thrown into an unfamiliar culture and surrounded by that unfamiliar culture, one of the responses that can occur is depression. It becomes more common when the person feels alienated from the outward culture. And from medicine, we learned that certain diseases, medications, can increase the odds of depression. And that now we're also understanding that inflammation can be an important part of what causes depression. Sociologists have noted that people are more likely to become depressed after they've gone through disruptive life changes. Psychologists have noted that if the person loses their mother before age 10, their risk of depression is greater as well. And from family studies, we have learned that people whose father was absent through childhood are more likely to become depressed as they get into adulthood, especially if that father was separated from them through divorce. Geneticists have found that depression is more common in people with a family history of eating disorders. And economists have noted that depression is more common amongst those who are experiencing poverty as well as unemployment. We're in the middle of that COVID pandemic, and a lot of people are unemployed. Boy, we've got to watch out for people getting depressed. Education has indicated to us that people who have lower academic ability are more likely to get depressed, and people who end up illiterate and unable to read effectively, again, more likely to get depressed. So all of these areas have increased our understanding of depression and things that can lead to it. Okay, now we go to just a quick look at epigenetics. So epigenetics, what this really notes is that environmental factors can affect gene expression. So what we encounter in our experiences can affect how our genes actually act and how they behave. So this can then go on at a number of different levels. And looking at it from one view, various genetic activity can then lead to developments in our nervous system and brain that influence our behavior in turn potentially influencing the environment around us that we experience. Now, this can go the other direction. A change in our environment might bring about a change in our behavior that also influences how our brain is acting, and that action in our brain might even influence which genes are active at that point in time and which become inactive. Or this can start at any other level. Okay, so this interaction between these levels means that changes any place along those lines can affect changes in the other parts of that person. So we need a lot of research to understand the interaction between genes, biological processes, behavior versus environment, again, involving many different disciplines. Now, the last on our list of characteristics development is plastic. And so what do they mean by that? Well, something that's plastic, it sort of has a shape, but it can be molded. And so plasticity is the idea that a person's traits may be molded by their experiences, that conditions can influence the outcome, and that as conditions change, so can the outcome. Key example, you read in your textbook, I think it's actually not till chapter 2, but you'll read about Kathleen Berger, the author's nephew David. Now, David was born with many physical challenges. He had serious eye problems, heart problems, some physical deformities in his limbs, and a bunch of other things. And so many people immediately predicted that David, his future looked very dim. They didn't even know if he'd live, and if he did, they assumed that he probably would be dependent on everyone else, not able to really do anything for himself. But fortunately, the parents had good information that told them about the plasticity of humans, that in fact, our environment can mold the outcomes. And they were told, we as humans have tremendous resilience, especially early in life. And so they were instructed by Kathleen Berger and other knowledgeable people to take care of his physical disabilities. They were able to do surgeries to help save one of his eyes and to get his heart fixed up, and then to work with him constantly. They had him in as many as 4 different schools at one time. And even though at one point early on, he had been identified as probably having intellectual disability, what we used to call mental retardation, by the time he got into grade school, he actually began skipping grades and eventually earned several doctoral degrees, and now makes a living translating textbooks from one language to another. Almost no one would have predicted this given situation when he was born. Now, what made the difference? Well, his parents had good information. They also had some resources, like they did have medical insurance so that he could get the surgeries he needed. Um, they had also access to some schools and people who were supportive. As a matter of fact, one of the big factors they think is they lived in Appalachian, which is that mountainous part of the country up there, where there's a lot of people with disabilities there. And so that being kind of a very common thing in their community, people didn't treat him really as being that much different. And the fact that they didn't treat him differently gave him a chance to actually develop his potential. So notice that the things in his environment came together for him to make it possible for a very positive outcome. So I think you have to look at this example of plasticity and resilience and be very careful about your predictions about people. You know, maybe things look very dim at some point in time with a person, but in fact, there is almost always the potential for some positive development and positive outcomes. So be very careful and look for the resources. Okay, now, I think lastly, yeah, this is the last thing we'll do on there. Let's have a look at differential sensitivity. This term indicates some people are more vulnerable to certain experiences. Some people are more resilient to negative experiences. And so things that might knock one person down, another person might just keep up and keep going, no problem, that sort of thing. So some of this can be genetic, some of it can be environmental. And here's an example of that. So to set this up, they discovered there is a particular gene. It's called the 5-HTTLPR gene. this gene has to do with transporting this neurotransmitter, this chemical in the brain called serotonin. And if this gene does not function properly, the person is more prone to problems with anxiety, depression, as well as risk-taking behavior. Now, there are two basic versions of this gene, a long and short version. The short version being the one that puts the person at greater risk for these kinds of problems. So the researchers identified children in an inner city community where there was a lot of violence and a lot of risk-taking behavior on the part of teenagers, adolescents. And they then took a group of children who volunteered for this experiment, and they checked to see which form of the gene they had. And you notice that the boxes here in dark were the children, teens who actually had greater genetic risk. They had the short version of that 5-HTT-LPR gene. And then they conducted an experiment where half of those teens and their families received what they called the Strong African American Families Intervention. Now that involved, working with those families to improve conditions, to improve consistent discipline and nurturing on the part of the parents, counseling, and was available for parents as well as adolescents, and a number of other things. And so notice what happened. Now, here's the control group, the group where they did not get that intervention. And you'll notice that the group of kids who had the riskier gene, the amount of risky behavior was much higher in that control group than kids who had less genetic risk. Over here are the kids and families that that did receive the Strong African American Families Intervention. And what do you notice? Well, the teens that had higher risk, now much less risk of risky behavior, still a little bit more than those that had the normal form of the gene, but not too much. Brought it way down. Now, it didn't really have much effect on those that had no genetic risk. That's true, but they were fairly low risk to begin with. So notice differential sensitivity. This particular form of the gene made these individuals more vulnerable to the effects of their environment. On the other hand, they responded more readily to a change in that environment and got more benefit from that intervention. So this is the idea of differential sensitivity. Okay, well, that's a whole long thing, but want to get you introduced to stuff. So pick up part 2, where we'll get the rest of the chapter, and have a great day. Bye-bye.